Thanks, Justin. Friends, it is a great joy to be with you this morning to talk about something that I actually love talking about because I don't think we talk about it enough. Darkness, right? And I want to start with a premise, and that is, if you, like me, were raised in a church in the 80s and 90s that wasn't really beginning to decline yet, you were raised with this image of lightness being the ideal. You were raised and we were conditioned to equate God with clarity, with brightness, with certainty. But friends, like much of church history, what we knew at one time doesn't hold up as strongly today. So we're going to talk about darkness, because before we can be the salt of the earth, before we can be the city on the hill, before we can let our shine brightly, we need to go on an inward journey, don't we? We need to go on a journey together to the dark. One of my favorite preachers is an Episcopalian author, Barbara Brown Taylor. She has this book called Learning to Walk in the Dark, where she describes this spirituality that we were raised on, so many of us, as a solar spirituality, where lightness is good and darkness is bad. But like most dichotomies, this just doesn't hold up today. Barbara Brown Taylor, in her book, Learning to Walk in the Dark, says that what we need is not a solar spirituality that privileges brightness and light as good. What we need is a lunar spirituality. We need a spirituality that is willing to go into dark places, willing to go down where people are, not on a mountainside where Jesus is shining brightly as he does at the Transfiguration, but we need to wrestle with our faith in the dark. And when you think about it, it's not just Barbara Brown Taylor who's saying this, it's the witness that we have in Scripture. Think about Moses and the Israelites as they are on Mount Sinai. The people stand at a distance, and Moses draws near to the thick darkness, which is where God was. And before Moses and the Israelites, think about Jacob on his way to reconciliation and redemption, wrestling with that stranger in the dark on the riverside at the Jabbok. God is not just in the light, friends. God is in the dark. Even at the very beginning of creation, as God is creating day and night, light and dark, God calls the darkness good. Think about the darkest place you have ever been. For me, I was 19 years old, a student at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, a member of Presbyterian campus ministry there at App State with our campus minister, Rocky Ward. And what I love about Rocky is Rocky had this great love of the outdoors like many of our scouts do. And Rocky loved caving. And so because those of us impressionable college students loved Rocky, our campus minister, we too loved caving, and we put up with Rocky renting a 15-passenger vehicle 2 or 3 times a year, packing us all into it, driving the miserable drive up I-81 from Boone, North Carolina, to some town in West Virginia that I don't even remember the name of, to go caving. Wearing overalls and boots, my headlamp on, turned on, shining brightly, I walked in, and I walked in, and I walked in. My footing was a little bit tenuous. I started to get really muddy. I slipped and fell a couple of times, especially coming out of some of those really tight cracks. And if you've ever been to a cave, you know something about darkness, because in a cave, there is no ambient light. There is no horizon on which to ground yourself looking out into the distance. And your depth perception starts to fade. And then I still remember Rocky's voice the first time he ever said it, the first time I ever heard it. Reach up and turn your light off. And if it wasn't dark before, friends, it got really dark really fast, because the dozen headlamps that had been lighting our way all turned off. And there we were in this cavernous space, and you couldn't even see 2 inches in front of you. That kind of dark is unsettling. But in that dark, you learn a thing or two, don't you? You learn how to place your feet gently and surely. You learn how to move slowly, or at least a little more slowly. You learn how to listen carefully to the noises around you. You learn how to depend on others, those in your group that had journeyed into the darkness with you. It was dark in that cave. But that's not the only place darkness happens, is it? Darkness happens in wilderness experiences, whether in a cave or on a mountaintop, whether in the desert or on the shores and banks of a river. And it is in wilderness spaces, in those places that can be the very darkest nights of our soul, where we learn something about ourselves, where we learn about our resilience, where we learn who we can truly trust, where we learn about who God created us and called us to be. Because, friends, we don't conquer darkness, we just adapt to it. Wilderness experiences, I think, are one of the most important things in our lives. Because it's there, whether in the cave, pitch black darkness, or the mountaintop, right before the light starts shining, that we are transformed. We are transformed and prepared. Wilderness experiences prepare us for those things in life that we don't even know we are preparing for. Because if you can go into a pitch black dark cave, if you can summit a mountain, if you can go rafting down a river, if you have experienced that kind of wilderness, when the cancer diagnosis comes, when divorce becomes real, when grief of a loved one passing is a little too sharp for that day, you remember that you have done something really hard in the dark before. And you survive, and you thrive, and you put one foot in front of the other, because that's what you do in darkness. You put one foot in front of the other, journeying on. You put one foot in front of the other because it is what God tells you to do. And then you go tell someone else about it. I think it is in these dark places, these dark nights of the soul, where we learn something about ourselves, but maybe more importantly, we learn something about God. I want to tell you one of my favorite words to say, that you're going to repeat it after me. Say this word: theophany. I love it because it's one of these words that ends with that E sound, and you can't make an E sound without a really big smile. Say it again: theophany. Right? You're chuckling. Because a theophany is how God shows up in our lives. Specifically, a theophany is how God shows up to humans. Theophanies are the things that we are called to tell others about. Whether in the dark or the light, we are called to tell others about how God shows up in our lives. I want to read you a theophany from Scripture, from the prophet Isaiah. A beloved king has just died. His name is Uzziah. It wasn't always great living under Uzziah, but Uzziah provided people stability. He provided people with a firm place to practice their faith. And then he dies. And so Isaiah has this theophany where God comes to him, and it goes like this. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of God's glory. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. Friends, it is in the darkness where we see God show up in our lives. Maybe not as this vision of Isaiah with all the wings and with all the eyes and with the coal touching our lips, but a theophany in the darkness where we can say, God, send me. That's a gift, not just for ourselves, but for a world that needs us to be salt and light in a city on the hill. Because darkness is real, and sometimes it is bad. So friends, pay attention to the word that you need to utter in this darkness for yourself, for your neighbor. Pay attention to the word that God is uttering to you. And remember to tell someone else about it.